All right, welcome back, guys, to task list B and task list C. We're going to start off with task list B, B-01 through B-11. B-01, use the dimensions of applied behavior analysis, written by Bear, Wolf, and Risley, to evaluate whether interventions are behavior analytic in nature. So when you're looking at the 7 dimensions of behavior, you're going to think of ABA, what we're in, right? Applied behavior analysis. That gives you 3 of the 7 so far. But what do they mean? So the first up we have is applied. Applied means socially significant. Is the behavior of choosing socially significant to the individual and those around the individual? Will it make a difference in their life? So apply this in everyday life. What is socially significant in your life? What is socially significant to your individual that you work with? Think socially valid. Will it make a difference? Is it valid? Behaviors that could be valid would be dressing themselves, learning to use the toilet, brushing their teeth, self-hygiene. Those are socially significant to an individual, and they should learn how to utilize those skills. Then we have analytic. This is the functional relation and experimental control. This is part of graphing. Does your AB design have experimental control? When you utilize baseline and then the intervention and then baseline and the intervention again, when you repeat that, is there experimental control? Did the independent variable change the dependent variable? When you manipulated the independent variable, did it change the behavior of the individual? For instance, if you are working in a classroom setting and you decide to work with the individual who is trying to access attention from the teacher, the behavior here is access to attention. So they're probably being disruptive in some way. Let's say, for instance, they're yelling out. Your intervention is to teach them an alternative way to get attention. So we're going to use differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. We'll get to the differential reinforcements later on, but we're going to start briefly talking about them now. So, your intervention, DRA, you manipulated the DRA intervention into being able to make a difference in that individual's life by teaching them how to communicate properly. Okay, so DRA, the intervention, you're teaching them how to communicate properly. So that way the behavior of yelling out and interrupting is eventually placed on extinction or just decreased to a very minimal. All right, so in order to see a functional relation or experimental control within that type of experiment, you're going to want to see that the DRA actually increased for behavior of hand raising and the behavior of yelling out or interrupting decreased. So when you pull up a graph, you're going to see that the behavior in baseline decreased in intervention. That is experimental control. Then you have behavioral. This is observable and measurable. So in everyday life, you're going to want to write in technological term what it looks like. So what does the behavior look like? What are they doing? What is the topography or the magnitude of the behavior? What is the function of the behavior? That is behavioral, that is observable. Now, measurable part, how are you going to measure the behavior? Can you count it? Do you need to decrease or increase the latency or IRT? What do you need to do? Then we have conceptually systematic. Conceptually systematic pertains to our 3 principles. We have reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Those 3 principles we're going to be utilizing throughout everything we do with our client. Then we have effective. Effective is how effective was your intervention? Did it work? Was it effective for the client to make a difference in the client's life? So the change is significant to the participant, it's cost effective, and probable to be generalized and maintained over time. Then we have technological, which is written so that anyone can understand the program being delivered or socially significant target behavior. So think about a recipe. Can you understand the recipe that you look at to make the dinner? If you can't, then you need to rewrite how that recipe is introduced to you. If somebody comes up to you on your team and says, hey, I have no idea what I'm doing based off of the sheet that you gave them, then you aren't being technological enough. And you're going to have to rewrite that paper so that anyone can understand it. A parent, a caregiver, a teacher, anyone implementing the intervention. And then you have generality. This involves your settings, your subjects, and your behaviors. The behavior that you establish that's socially significant and improves the daily living of the individual. Can that behavior be introduced in other settings? To other subjects? Is it going to be socially significant to peers? And the behaviors, do the behaviors go from school to home without any other behaviors happening? So think about all these 7 dimensions when you're utilizing your daily work, when you're going through your mocks, when you're taking your exam. They apply to everything we do. And read the article by Bear, Wolf, and Risley in regards to the applied dimensions, the analytic dimension, the behavioral dimension, the conceptually systematic, effective, technological, and generality dimensions. You're going to want to know about these dimensions, and their article is amazing. Here's just a brief visual for memorizing the 7 dimensions broken down in very layman terms. Their article is called Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis by Bear, Wolf, and Risley, and that can be found on JABA, Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. B-2, review and interpret articles from the behavior analytic literature. So in order to utilize what we do every single day for our individuals and be a good BCBA, we're going to constantly want to research everything that we do. We're not going to want to take somebody else's intervention and utilize it on our child because it could be completely different from what our child's behaviors are to what their child's behaviors are. When you're reading and dissecting articles, look at the methods section, look at the settings and subjects, look at the measurement that they used, look at the experimental design they utilized. Try to understand and read it. What were the results? What was the discussion on? Understand the articles. Even if it's a small article that you want to start off with and work your way up to the 30-page articles, you're going to need to know how to read an article. And a lot of times colleges will teach you how to read an article, but also doing this on your own sets you up for being a really good BCBA, BCABA, or RBT. B-03. Systematically arrange independent variables to demonstrate their effects on dependent variables. So when looking back at the 7 dimensions, we spoke about analytic. Analytic is asking you if there's a functional relation or experimental control within the experimental design, saying that A and B actually made a difference. So B made a difference on A, baseline. The experiment, the intervention, made a difference on the dependent variable. So the independent variable is usually the intervention or treatment that you are using. And then the dependent variables, the target behavior for specifically what you are increasing or decreasing or putting on extinction. The main question is, what is the independent variable that demonstrates their effects on the dependent variable? Was it? So think about, was it the independent variable who made the changes so that the behavior increased, decreased, or was placed on extinction? Look back at the scenario with using DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. We're teaching an individual how to speak appropriately so they can gain attention in an appropriate way rather than yelling out in the classroom. Okay? If it was not, then the information is not valid. So if the independent variable did not demonstrate that it changed the dependent variable, it's not valid information. You have to go back and figure out what occurred and either redo the experiment somehow or change something, or use a different independent variable, okay? Because sometimes we can have confounding variables. We can have environmental variables that get in our way, and we just didn't notice in the time being, so we need to figure out why the independent variable did not demonstrate what it needed to demonstrate on this behavior, and because of that, we may have to change the intervention, or we may have to manipulate the environment, or we may have to manipulate the confounding variables, or be aware of the confounding variables even. B-04, use withdrawal reversal designs. So withdrawal and reversal are almost systematically the same thing. There's only one difference. A withdrawal is going to be your basic ABAB design. That's it. It's a term used by some authors as a synonym for ABAB design, also used to describe experiments in which an effective treatment is sequentially or partially withdrawn to promote the maintenance of behavior changes. Whereas a reversal is a little bit more in depth and has a lot more than an ABAB design. So this is any experimental design in which the researcher attempts to verify the effects of the independent variable by reversing responding to a level obtained in a previous condition. So it encompasses experimental designs in which the independent variable is withdrawn. So we can think of ABA designs, ABAB, BAB, DRA, DRI, DRO, and NCR. Here's what a basic withdrawal design looks like. ABAB, you see that baseline is A, treatment or intervention is B, baseline again is A, and treatment again is B. If we were to use an ABCABD design, you would see baseline, treatment, baseline, treatment, baseline, treatment, baseline. It could change up that way as well. Usually that is a multiple type of reversal, multiple treatment reversal. So here we're looking at a number of cigarettes smoked and on the days, and it looks like here there was some sort of experimental control because you can see that the treatment did in fact decrease the amount of cigarettes they had per day. And then when they go back to baseline to check to see if it did make in fact a difference, you notice that it does go back up when there's no treatment, and then the behavior decreases again when treatment is placed in again. So the one thing about a reversal design is you can have some type of effect, which is called multiple treatment effects. There are AKAs for those words as well. Make sure you look them up. But that is when you utilize a treatment, and sometimes that treatment, like in an ABCD design, that treatment interferes with the other treatments, or that treatment interferes with baseline in a way that you don't want it to interfere. We'll get more in depth in that term later on. B-05, use alternating treatments, multi-element designs. There are lots of AKAs for this specific design. Make sure you memorize the AKAs. An alternating treatment design is the rapid alteration of two or more distinct treatments, the independent variable, while their effects on the target behavior, the dependent variable, are measured. The one thing you have to look for with alternating treatment design is sequence effects. Sometimes you can have one intervention rub off onto the next intervention, and that can play a role as well. Alternating treatment designs are typically used in functional analysis. So when you are looking for the function of the behavior. And this is what a functional analysis will look like when you're trying to determine what the function of the behavior is. Not always is a functional analysis like an ABAB design. Sometimes it looks just like this, where you see that the escape condition is potentially the function of the behavior. And you'll know that it's potentially the function of behavior. It's because it's the highest on the graph, whereas the other ones are a little bit lower on the graph, so they're not stating that that is the potential function of the behavior. It looks like this is escape maintained. B-06, use changing criterion designs. This design in experimental designs is in which initial baseline is followed by a series of treatment phases consisting of successive and gradually changing criteria for reinforcement or punishment. Experimental control is evidenced by the extent the level of responding changes to conform each new criterion. So when they meet the criterion, you notice that they're gaining experimental control. You can also check in with experimental control by reversing to the previous criterion and then quickly reversing back to the current criterion, and that's another way to gain experimental control. With changing criterion design, the behavior that you are utilizing needs to be in the individual's repertoire, and it cannot be used for shaping or teaching a new behavior, but it can be used for shaping dimensions such as the magnitude or the frequency of the behavior. this is what a changing criterion design looks like. You see on the left side on the vertical axis where the dependent variable is shown is the number of math problems completed. And then on the bottom of the graph, the horizontal axis is the intervention or the IV, independent variable, that has been implemented. And each dashed line that you see that is horizontally placed is where the criterion is needed for them to meet in order for them to experience experimental control. If they were to go back to a previous criterion, you would see a dip real quick, and then you would see it increase again back to the current criterion. B-07, use multiple baseline designs. There are 3 types of multiple baseline designs. We have settings, subjects, and behaviors. Multiple baseline design is an experimental design that begins with a concurrent measurement of 2 or more behaviors in a baseline condition, followed by the application of the treatment variable to one of the behaviors while baseline conditions remain in effect for the other behaviors. So we can use multiple baseline design for baseline logic, which is prediction, replication, and verification. Okay. After maximum change has been noted in the first behavior, the treatment variable is applied in sequentially fashion to each of the other behaviors in the design. Experimental control is demonstrated if each behavior shows similar changes when and only when the treatment variable is introduced. So when you are within behavior 1, for instance, and you've just taken baseline, you are now implementing the treatment. When you implement the treatment for behavior 1, behavior 2, and behavior 3 should still be in baseline. And then you implement treatment for behavior 2, while behavior 3 is still in baseline. If behavior 2, the treatment is implemented and it goes in the same direction as behavior 1, based on what you're looking to do, increase or decrease, then you have verified and predicted based on what you have seen on your graph. Predicting would be saying that the behavior is staying the same and it's not going to increase or decrease. Verification would be that when you implement it into behavior 2, that it actually verifies the experiment is working and does the same thing for behavior 2 as it did for behavior 1. And then to replicate it, you are putting it, the intervention within behavior 1 and behavior 2 and behavior 3. You are now replicating the intervention, which means you are now verifying that all 3 behaviors could be utilized for this specific intervention. And this is potentially what a multiple baseline design could look like, depending on your behavior or who you're working with. This one is multiple baseline across participants or subjects. As you can see, they implemented the intervention for behavior 1, or a participant 1, I apologize, and then they implemented for participant 2, and it looks like it took off in the same direction, and then they implemented it for participant 3, but of course the information in participant 3 would probably need to go on for a few more data points in order to know if it was 100% verified in working. There are 2 forms of a multiple baseline design. The first we have is a delayed multiple baseline design. The initial baseline and intervention begin just delayed. So as we saw, let me go back to this one right here. It would not start at day 1 or session 1. It would be a little more delayed, meaning session for participant 1, session 1 would occur because the participant was available. But if participant 2 and 3 were not available, you could start their baseline on day 3 or day 5. So it would just be a delayed baseline, but you would still implement the same intervention along the way. So again, this is what different types of designs look like. B-08, use multiple probe designs. This is another variation of the multiple baseline design. It's used typically for checking in or maintenance or teaching a skill. So this is a method of analyzing the relation between the independent variable and acquisition of a successive approximation or task sequence. Probes provide the basis for determining whether behavior change has occurred prior to intervention. So you're going to kind of use this for check-in or maintenance after an intervention has ended. So for instance, if your intervention has ended with your DRA for the classroom of your child yelling to get attention, and now the individual has been respectful, they've been raising their hand for a month or two now, and now you think that the intervention can be decreased and eventually you don't need it anymore. This is where you're going to need a multiple probe design. You're going to utilize the multiple probe design to check in. So say that the intervention has ended successfully and the individual is now in maintenance. A week after the individual has been off of treatment, you're going to check in and you're going to probe to see if they're able to participate without yelling. Then you're going to probe again 3 days later and 4 days later. And you're going to check in to see if they are able to communicate properly from using the DRA and if it has now become maintained. This is what a multiple probe design looks like. As you can see, the data points in baseline are not connected. Please do not get this confused with a scatter plot. A scatter plot is just one big graph with a bunch of dots or data points not connected. This is only baseline, the data points are not connected, and then during the intervention probe, they are connected. B-9, use combinations of design elements. This is just saying that we combine our experimental designs together to see if that strengthens or weakens the individual and their behavior. So we typically use combinations of designs like DRI, DRA, NCR. We use those as more of like a strengthen design because sometimes individuals don't do well with just one design, and when you implement 2 or 3, it typically has a better strengthening towards not only manipulating the independent variable and the intervention, but also making a difference in the individual's life. So you'll see that when you read different articles that they combine a lot of designs, and also by getting used to combination designs will make you a better BCBA because you'll understand why they are utilized together and why they pair well. B-10, component analysis. So component analysis can be used when you're using combined graphs or combined types of designs. So for instance, if you are looking at 3 different types of designs, say DRA, DRI, and DRO, you're going to put this within a component analysis and see which one works the best. You're going to take out one intervention at a time to see if it works better or worse with the individual. Then you're going to put it back into the component analysis and take out the next one, say DRA. You're going to test it out, and then you're going to put it back. And then you're going to do the next one. And you're going to test each one individually, one at a time. This is to see sometimes what your final best treatment is. Sometimes these are used for alternating treatment designs when you want to know what your final best treatment design is. And that's saying, did DRA, DRI, or DRO work the best for this individual? Or does the treatment package altogether work the best? Sometimes all 3 work the best compared to just one. This is what a component analysis can look like. You see that we are at baseline, treatment, baseline, another type of treatment, baseline, 2 treatments combined, X and Y. That can be like a component analysis because it has to be 2 or more components. And then it looks like they have baseline again, and then they have component analysis again, baseline, component analysis, baseline, just one intervention, baseline, and one intervention. So they utilize different methods to see which one would work best for the individual. B11, conduct a parametric analysis. So a parametric analysis has to do with the value or dosage of an individual. So for instance, if you are using an intervention that requires an intermittent schedule, such as FR1 or VR1, you're going to use a parametric analysis to check in what the dosage or value would be needed to be successful in your intervention. For instance, if you want to check in to see if FR3 or FR6 or FR8 would work best with your individual, you can test those three dosages to see if they work. Which one has the most valuable or value to the individual? Which one is going to be more successful with the individual? Is the individual willing to work on an FR6 schedule? Or do you need to stay on an FR3? Which dosage is needed? And here's just a breakdown of parametric and component. Not typically seen within the 4th edition task list is the non-parametric. It is something needed to know, but not necessarily used in real life, but I would recommend memorizing it for exam purposes. A non-parametric is just turning the intervention on or off, A, B, A, B. Task list C. So now we get into task list C, very short and very brief, C-01 to C-03. C-01, state and plan for the possible unwanted effects of reinforcement. Because yes, like everything in life, not everything goes as planned. So, a few things that can be unwanted. Reinforcement can be temporary, meaning it's not always going to be reinforcing to the individual. It can be viewed as aversive, so something the individual maybe doesn't like. Relying on the use of contrived reinforcers instead of natural reinforcers. We know in our field we eventually want to get to natural reinforcers, right? We want to fade the contrived reinforcers away. But sometimes those individuals rely on the contrived reinforcers, and sometimes it's very difficult to get them used to the natural reinforcers in everyday life. So we need to work on fading those contrived reinforcers so that more natural reinforcers are more, the individual is more compliant with. For instance, praise. Praise is a natural reinforcer that oftentimes has to be paired with a contrived reinforcer. Over time, that contrived reinforcer can be faded back and praise can be given to the individual more often instead of the contrived reinforcer. Think about everyday life. We don't typically get handed a lollipop every time we do something good. Most of the time, somebody says, "Good job, you did excellent, high five." So we want to fade to natural reinforcers as quickly as possible so that that individual doesn't get used to lollipops all the time for doing something good. Also, the general public thinks of it as bribery. It's not bribery. Bribery usually comes before something needs to get done, and then reinforcement usually comes after as a consequence. Also, the use of potential harmful reinforcers, like I mentioned, a lollipop, that can be harmful to individuals. Having sugar every time they do something good, that's not the greatest or healthiest method to use for reinforcers. So we want to try to stay away from those reinforcers as much as possible. Obviously, there could be situations where the individual is only willing to work for a lollipop, but down the road, we can work on fading those to natural reinforcers or even a different, healthier reinforcer such as strawberries or blueberries down the road. And then, of course, behavior contrast. And this typically occurs when the intervention is not successful at generality. So it's not generalizing to other settings or individuals. So we want to make sure that we work on behavior contrast as well. For instance, if your intervention is at a work setting and the individual is cursing a lot and you put them on an intervention at work to no longer curse, and then they go home and they curse up a storm like a pirate, that's a positive behavioral contrast. It's because the intervention was not applied in the other setting. So we want to make sure that we apply the intervention to all settings that the individual is going to be utilizing. C-2, state and plan for the possible unwanted effects of punishment. So just like reinforcement, punishment has an abundance of different unwanted effects that could occur. For instance, society dislikes this and does not want us to use these procedures. So a lot of times, society thinks of punishment like before the 90s and 80s of smacking the child's butt or putting them in the corner with a dunce cap. Or washing their mouth out with soap. Those were procedures used many years ago before ABA was introduced, and now we don't use those. Obviously, we've never used those in our field. I mean, there were before ABA, different circumstances where hospitals or institutions would use of these type of things of occurrence, such as shock in our field was a huge thing, but we don't use those anymore. And I think that our field needs to advocate more on punishment and how we use it, because we use punishment appropriately. And then it can be temporary, just like reinforcement. Punishment can be temporary. Individuals who are being punished for one thing could eventually no longer care that they're being punished anymore and just keep doing the behavior. It may have a negative reinforcement effect on their behavior. So this could have an emotional outlook on their behavior. Some individuals don't like being punished, so that could cause other challenging behaviors to occur. And then another factor is it does not address the cause of a challenging behavior in the first place. So when we use punishment alone, it's not really directing the individual on what they should do. Saying don't do that, the individual is not going to know what they should be doing. So that's why we tend to pair punishment with reinforcement 24/7. It should never be used alone. Punishment should always be paired with reinforcement. Then you have emotional and aggressive reactions that may be produced by the client. Like I said, some clients may not agree to being punished, saying don't do that, and the individual flips a chair or a desk over because they're mad you told them not to do something. That's an emotional aggressive reaction. So again, teaching an individual what's right versus wrong, basically. Escape and avoidance of the people implementing the procedure. So again, some individuals do not enjoy implementing punishment procedures. Some parents even ask that a punishment procedure is not even implemented within an intervention. You may have that happen. So just make sure that you are aware that trying to work around these situations and utilizing reinforcement as much as possible. Imitation by the individual. You say, don't do that. It's like almost talking to your own child where they say, don't do that, and imitate you back. They're going to imitate your behavior just as much as anyone would try to imitate your behavior that doesn't want to be punished. So you're going to make sure that it is the most neutral type of punishment that somebody cannot imitate. It requires lots of supervision, resources, and time. This is why we want to make sure that it is combined with reinforcement, because yes, punishment can be used harmfully. Like I mentioned before, shock was used many years ago, and that could leave a scar on an individual. Also, many places use restraints. I know some states have regulations on how restraints are used, so that's why it requires so much supervision, resources, and time, because we could potentially hurt our client and put our client in harm's way if we don't use certain sources correctly. You should always recommend and use reinforcement over punishment any day. Reinforcement will always come first. If punishment is necessary, always combine it with reinforcement. And of course, again, behavior contrast is a thing. C-03, state and plan for the possible unwanted effects of extinction. Extinction burst. This is when you put in a behavior on extinction, and then all of a sudden their behavior increases significantly within the first few days, and then it decreases because they're not obtaining any reinforcement from their behavior. Extinction-induced aggression. Yeah, individuals are going to get mad. They're going to be mad that you put their behavior on extinction. They're not getting reinforcement anymore for something they were doing that they shouldn't have been doing. Extinction is difficult to use with clients that rarely display the target behavior. When putting a behavior on extinction, it needs to be a behavior that is consistently occurring. It cannot be a behavior that happens once a month, because it's going to be on a variable schedule, and as we know, variable schedules are very hard to put on extinction. It's also difficult to know what is reinforcing a behavior sometimes. For instance, the individual in the classroom, it could not be attention-based. It could be some other reason that the individual is talking out in class. Maybe they don't know how to functionally communicate, or maybe they are trying to escape classwork. It can sometimes be very hard to know what's reinforcing the individual. It's also difficult to control the reinforcer for a client's challenging behavior sometimes. If at school you're able to control it, but at home it's harder to control because they have siblings, you're going to have that scenario where both settings are not being maintained with extinction. So we want to make sure that we're working with both settings. Sometimes if you're working in a school setting, you're going to work with a BCBA that's in a home setting. So collaboration's typically involved for an extinction procedure. Also, difficult or dangerous behaviors should not be ignored. Typically when we're putting a dangerous behavior on extinction, we want to make sure that we have the proper resources and supervision again, and we also want to make sure that we're reinforcing appropriate behaviors. Sometimes the challenging behaviors placed on extinction are imitated by other people. Think about peers and siblings. They're going to try to copy you so that they egg on the individual, unfortunately. That's when we work with those individuals in the classroom, the teacher, anyone that's going to be around the individual we're working with, so that we can also make sure we're all collaborating together and placing that behavior on extinction. Extinction that is not used in a treatment package can cause ethical concerns. Read your ethics book. It's extremely important. Always use extinction with reinforcement. Again, reinforcement should always be used. Extinction and punishment should never be used by itself. And lastly, behavior contrast is going to potentially occur as well. That is the end of task list B and C. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Also, on that note, we do have classes coming up on allaboutThatABA.com. Please check those out on the website and sign up. There are limited seats because we like to make sure our classes are small and more individually based in learning. It's fun. We play Kahoot. We go through questions. We have courses available, tutoring. Check it out. Again, thank you for checking out my channel on All About That ABA and ABA. Good luck on your exam.